Yo guys, what is going on? Lucky here and welcome to Secret Tanks Wargaming Doesn't Want You to Know About Yet Part 2. And yeah, if you think like, huh, part 2? Yeah, that's exactly right. This is part 2 of this mini-series that I'm doing. So if you are just here and you have no clue about what this all is, then I highly suggest you go watch part 1 right now. I'll put a link to part 1 in the description down below. So go watch that video. I'll explain in that video how this all comes to stand. But if you've already watched part 1, then hey, you've clicked on the right video, because today we are going to be continuing our little mini-series and we're going to dive into the world of the Soviet secret vehicles. And oh boy, if you thought part 1 already was a long video, then prepare for this one, because I think this one is even going to be longer, because the Soviet nation has so many secret hidden tanks that are deeply hidden into the game files. So if you're interested in what the Soviet Union has to offer for you in Wargaming Secret Tank Vault, then make sure to stay tuned all the way up until the end of the video, because I'll be covering each and every single one of them. So guys, now without further ado, let's jump right into the first secret Soviet tank. So first off, we have the KV4 Kuzlov Ski. I think I pronounced that right, and if I didn't, then I'm sure a lot of my Russian viewers will correct me with that. But anyways, the KV4 Kuzlov Ski is a tier 8 premium Soviet heavy tank that really hasn't been released yet. I do remember that Quickie Baby made a video about this tank, I think already about a year and a half ago, explaining that this was going to be a new upcoming tier 8 premium tank, but since then I actually haven't heard anything about it. Personally, I think this might actually be a premium tank, or this might be a Clan Wars reward tank. Who knows, but for now we're just going to take a look at the stats of this thing. So if you take a look at the stats, the gun does 320 alpha damage with 227 millimeters of penetration, which is quite about the same as the original KV4's gun. It has a reload time of 10 seconds, which is also about the same of the KV4, and a turret rotation 25 degrees a second, 7 degrees of gun depression, 2.7 seconds aim time, and 0.36 dispersion. Well, what can I say? Typical Russian accuracy, but the DPM isn't that great, and I know the KV4's DPM also isn't that great, but I don't know, I thought this one might actually have some extra DPM to have as a special feature, since this is a premium version of the KV4, but sadly it hasn't, since the DPM is about as shit at 1772 damage per minute. So if you move on to the survivability, it has 1500 hit points, which is not as much as the KV4, but it's still rather decent, actually kind of standard for tier 8 heavy standards. It has 180 millimeters of frontal hull armor, 125 at the side and 90 at the rear, and that 125 millimeters of side armor is going to be very nice, since it allows this thing to side scrape pretty damn effectively. And also, if you take a look at the turret position, it's not fully rear mounted, but I guess it's kind of mid mounted, so that makes it semi-usable to actually use in side scraping combat. It has 180 millimeters of frontal turret armor, 160 at the side and 100 at the rear, but I guess this little thing right here is going to be weak spot. I don't know exactly how thick it is, but it just looks like your typical Russian weak spot. So next up is the mobility. This thing weighs 92 tons and it has a 1200 horsepower engine, which results in a horsepower to ton ratio of 12.96, which is actually pretty decent if you compare it to the KV4's terrible horsepower to ton ratio. It goes 30 km per hour forwards and 60 km per hour backwards, and has a traverse speed of 20 degrees a second, and ooh, that kind of makes it very vulnerable for fast and speedy light tanks who might actually circle it. But nevertheless, let's move on to the concealment. Not really that important because it's a heavy tank, but still it's pretty bad as expected, since it's basically a box. But spotting range, 360 meters of view range, yeah, it's typical Russian. Most of the Russians don't really have that good view range, and this one is no exception. So overall, stat-wise, I can't really see anything special about the KV4 Kuzlov Ski, but I think it looks kind of interesting, and I think it would be actually a very cool tank for Wargaming to add as a new tier 8 Russian premium heavy tank. Oh wait, I digress, another tier 8 Russian premium heavy tank. But now, without further ado, let's move on to the second secret Soviet tank. So next up, we have a very interesting one. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Object 777 version 2. And funny story about this thing, this thing was actually speculated to be the follow-up of the T10 once the T10 line and the IS-7 line got split up. So people actually thought that this thing was going to be the next follow-up to the new T10 line. But of course the Object 277 proved everyone wrong, since the 277 is now the successor of the T10. But what was the deal with the 777 then? Because this thing was actually well known about, because some people already discovered it earlier in the in-game files, while the 277 was nowhere to be seen in the in-game files. So I guess Wargaming created the 277 on purpose to actually make it a logical follow-up of the T10. I don't know, but this thing is actually sitting in the in-game file for about 1 year now already, and to be honest, I really don't know what Wargaming's plans are with this thing, since they haven't really teased anything, or they haven't really talked about this thing at all. So I believe this is going to be maybe a tier 10 Clan Wars reward tank. I don't know, I guess we'll have to see in the future, but let's take a look at its stats. So the gun looks very familiar because it kind of looks like the IS-4 gun. It has 440 alpha damage with 258mm of penetration and an 11-second reload. Again, very comparable to an IS-4 gun, which is of course not really a bad thing. So then, gun depression is actually quite poor, but then again, it's Russian, it's only -5 degrees. Aim time is 2.5 seconds and dispersion is 0.35, which is actually rather okay for Russian standards. But then again, the IS-4's gun also has about the same aim stats, so I guess this thing literally uses the same gun as the IS-4, or maybe a little modification of it. And then 2.2k DPM is also not that bad. Then moving on to survivability, this thing has 2100 hit points, it has 132mm of frontal hull armor, 115 at the side and 45 at the rear, which on paper doesn't really look that impressive, but if you take a look at the hull shape, damn, I think I've never seen such steep angling on an upper plate, but that also results in quite a big lower plate. So I guess hull armor wise, this thing doesn't really shine that much. But if you go take a look at the turret, which is 258mm thick at the front, 225 at the sides and 90 at the rear. And if you take a look at the shape, it kind of reminds me of the T10's turret shape. And of course the T10 has a very decent turret for its tier. So I guess turret armor wise, this thing is gonna be pretty damn strong. So then next up, let's take a look at the mobility, and I have high hopes for this one because this thing weighs almost 50 tons. It has an 850 horsepower engine, which results in a very, very healthy horsepower to ton ratio of 17.07, which is very good for a heavy tank. Then if you take a look at the top speed, it goes 50 km per hour forwards and 16 km per hour backwards. Again, exceptional for a heavy tank. And then 29 degrees per second traverse speed is also actually dead average for a heavy tank. And concealment's not really important, and view range is a very healthy 390 meters, which is quite decent considering it's Russian. So again, as I already said, I think this thing is going to be yet another tier 10 Clan Wars reward tank, or maybe yet another tier 10 regular Soviet heavy tank. I don't know, maybe Wargaming snitches another line of heavy tanks, so we might actually get a total of 5 Russian heavy tank lines in total. Man, just imagine how crazy that would be. But anyways, I do not know for sure, of course, but for now it just remains hidden deeply into the World of Tanks game files without a clue of what it could possibly be. So then, the first secret vehicle of the Soviet nation, we have again a version of the KV4, but this time it's the KV4 KTTS. I don't really know what KTTS stands for. Maybe some of you know. If you do, please let me know in the comment section down below. But anyways, this is actually a tank destroyer version of the KV4. And as you take a look at the hull, it looks kind of similar, and it kind of looks like the Kuzlov Ski's hull. So let's actually see how this thing is going to be playing. So again, this thing is using pretty much the same gun as the KV4 and the KV4 Kuzlov Ski. So it has 320 damage per shot, 227mm of penetration, but since this is a tank destroyer, it has a much faster rate of fire of 7.45, making it a reload of 8 seconds, which is pretty damn good. Then gun traverse 25 degrees a second is actually rather decent, pretty average for a tank destroyer. Gun depression not so good, but hey, it's Russian, -5 degrees. Gun traverse limits is actually very, very strange, since this thing can turn 15 degrees to the left, but 45 degrees to the right, which is, I don't know, very weird. I can't also really tell why that is, looking at the game model, but I guess they had its reason for it. But anyways, let's just move on. It has 2.4 seconds aim time and 0.35 dispersion. But the main difference with the KTTS and the Kuzlov Ski and the KV4 is that the KTTS actually has a very good DPM of 2.3 100k, which is very nice, but then again, kind of expectable since this is a tank destroyer version. But since it's a tank destroyer version, does it also have the same armor as the KV4 and the KV4 Kuzlov Ski? Well, let's take a look, and oh boy, I guess it kind of has, maybe even better, since this thing has 1200 hit points, not as much as the KV4, but it has 200 millimeters of frontal armor. And I guess that is gonna be rather competitive, because if you take a look right here, this is rather rounded, which also increases the total value, and this is also not completely flat, but also has a slight slope, so I guess it's gonna be around 225 millimeters effective armor at the front, which is rather decent. And it also has 125 millimeters of side armor, so this thing can actually pretty effectively side scrape for a tank destroyer. But I guess that gun traverse is gonna limit that, especially from the left side. But I guess we'll have to see how that plays out if this thing actually gets released. And then again, also 125 millimeters at the rear, which is also very nice, and it also means that the more low tier light tanks can't even pan you at the rear, which could be rather funny. But again, I think this thing at the top of the tank should actually be a weak spot. I don't know if it is, but I guess we'll have to see and wait for the armor model to find out for sure. So mobility, is it as bad as the KV4? And oh, it kind of looks like it, since this thing weighs 100 tons, has also 1200 horsepower engine, which makes it actually a rather okay 12 horsepower to ton ratio. And then again, 12 is not particularly fast for tank destroyer slash heavy tank purposes, but it's also not KV4 slow, so I guess this thing is slightly faster than the KV4. But it has the same top speed of 35 km per hour, 10 km per hour backwards, which I guess is gonna be a pain in the ass, because 10 km per hour backwards, especially if you're playing a tank destroyer and you have to pull back once you get spotted. And oh boy, I think this thing gets spotted a lot because the camo value isn't that great. I guess that 10 km per hour reverse speed is gonna come and play there. And then traverse speed 25 degrees per second is actually kinda okay, I guess. So then spotting range is absolutely terrible. It has 350 meters view range, so this thing is really gonna rely on decent scouts in order to do good. And also signal range is 459, also isn't particularly good. So yeah, the KV4 KTDS, I don't know, I think it's also going to be some form of Clan Wars reward tank, or it might actually be a tier 8 premium Russian tank destroyer, which actually is going to be the first tier 8 premium Russian tank destroyer, and I think this one is going to be a very interesting one, since it looks like it's going to play just like the American T28. But again, I do not know for sure, of course, so I guess we just need to wait until Wargaming officially announces something relating the KTTS. So then, moving on to the next secret vehicle, we have a little least interesting one. We have the IS-2M. And I believe Des Games already made a video about the IS-2M a few weeks ago. But this thing basically is just another reincarnation of the premium version of the IS-2, but with a slightly different armor shape, I guess. But if you take a look at the gun stat, it's pretty much the same as the IS-2, so nothing really special there. But survivability, I think here comes a little difference, because it has 1300 hit points, which is also, I guess, the same as the IS-2, correct me if I'm wrong, but it has 100 millimeters of frontal hull armor, and looking at the hull shape, I think, or it might just be me, that it also might have some kind of V-shape implemented in it, or I don't know, it might just be me. It's kind of hard to see with the skirts though, but if that's the case, then this thing is going to be a complete game changer. Overall, I think the hull looks kind of silly with these little indents right here and the flat angled front hull, but then again, I think overall armor wise, it's gonna kind of play like just the normal IS-2. Then mobility wise, again, it's rather similar to the IS-2, so nothing really special there. Concealment also not really important since it's a heavy tank, and 350 view range, the standard bad Russian view range. So I think the IS-2M is gonna be yet another tier 7 Russian premium heavy tank, which I don't really know the purpose of, because stat wise it kind of looks very similar to the regular IS-2, except for some slightly different hull design. So my guess is that the sides might be, I don't know, some kind of V-shape, but other than that, I can't really think of anything special that the IS-2 has over the normal IS-2. So again, we just have to wait what Wargaming's plans are in order to find out for sure. Then next up in the list, we have a very interesting one. We have the Object 268 version 5. So we already have an Object 268 version 4, which also brought a lot of controversy with it, since it came with the Russian update, and it's basically, you know, the overpowered rear-gunned Russian tank destroyer that comes after the Su-263. You probably know what I mean, but this thing is a whole lot different, since this tank destroyer, this tier 10 Russian tank destroyer, actually has a rotating turret, and that is a complete game changer. But without saying too much, let's actually take a look at its model, and it kind of looks like an T10 hull, doesn't it really? I mean, the rear looks exactly like a T10 hull, and the front also kinda does. So I guess it's just a T10 hull with a bigger turret and a 152mm gun on there. So yeah, let's take a look at the stats on how this thing actually might play. So this thing has 750 alpha damage and 303mm penetration with an 18-second reload. So for now, this gun actually looks like the exact same gun as on the regular Object 268, but with a slightly worse reload, of course, I guess because it has a turret. Then turret rotation is 18 degrees per second, which is very, very slow. But then again, I think it's better that it's slow, because if this thing had like a whopping turret reverse, it would be completely overpowered. So I think that's only right. Then again, the gun depression, -5 degrees, pretty much Russian, and I think this might actually be a struggle for this thing, because this thing kind of has a heavy tank playstyle, just by the looks of it, and peaking ridge lines might be very good, especially with such a thick turret. So let's just move on to stat. It has 2.88 second aim time and 0.35 dispersion, which is not very good for tank destroyers, but it is very good for Russian standards, and it has a 2.3k damage per minute, which also isn't that great if you compare it to other tier 10 Russian tanks, but again, I think this is just a compensation for the fact that this thing actually has a fully rotatable turret. So now let's actually see how tough this thing is. So it has 1900 hit points, which is kinda average for a tank destroyer. It has 120mm of hull armor at the front, 90 at the sides, and 40 at the rear. And these are exact the same values as the T10, so I think it's pretty much confirmed that this is exactly just a T10 hull. But then the turret, if you take a look at that, the front is 230mm thick, which isn't particularly thick if you compare it to the IS-7's turret or the Object 277 turret. But I think just looking at the angles, it might be still pretty strong, except for maybe this little weak spot right here. So further on, it has 90mm of side turret armor, and it has 60mm of rear turret armor. So I think armor-wise, this thing isn't really gonna be like an IS-7, but still it will hold its ground on the tier 10 battlefield most of the times, I guess. So then mobility, let's see if this thing is anything fast. So it weighs 50 tons and it has a 750 horsepower engine, which results in a horsepower to ton ratio of 15, which is actually pretty quick for a turreted tank destroyer. I mean, if you compare it to the T30, it's about the same. So mobility wise, I think you need to compare it to the T30 a little bit. But the main thing that this thing has over the T30 is that this thing actually can go at 48 kilometers per hour forwards, which is pretty damn fast. So if this thing gets some momentum, it will actually reach that top speed. But then again, 15 kilometers per hour backwards might actually still kill it with pulling back behind ridge lines maybe. And 20 degrees per second to hull traverse is also rather slow. So I guess this thing might be quite vulnerable to fast. Then the concealment rating, I was about to say it's not important, but because it kind of plays like a heavy tank. But if you decide to play this as a traditional tank destroyer, I don't think you're gonna do that bad as well, since the camo rating is actually pretty decent for its size, and especially the size of the turret. And then the spotting range, again, typical Russian view range, 360 meters view range. So you're gonna be pretty depending on your scouts in order to do well in this thing. So yeah guys, that pretty much wraps it up for the Object 268 version 5. What do I think about it? I think it's a very cool concept, because we don't really have that many turreted tier 10 tank destroyers. I guess the only one we have is the T110E5, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess if Wargaming manages to add this thing in the regular tech tree somehow, it will be a pretty cool addition to the game. So I really don't hope this is gonna be yet another special tier 10 Cloudwars or War tank. If that's the case, I'll be rather sad, because I would like to have this thing in my garage for real, because I think it looks like a quite fun tank and also quite a balanced tank to play. So next up, we also have quite a weird one. It's the T44 122. So I guess the name already kind of says it. It's just the T44, but with a 122mm gun. And this thing, I actually do know what it's for. This thing was actually gifted to some of the earlier beta testers in World of Tanks. So actually only a handful of people own this thing, and I guess that regular World of Tanks players can't really get their hands on it as well. But is it any good? Well, let's take a look at it. So as expected, it uses a IS-like gun with 390 alpha damage and 175mm of penetration with a 15-second reload, but it has a 50 degrees per second turret reverse. That's absolutely rapid for the kind of gun it has. But the downside is it only has -4 gun depression, probably because of the size of the gun, and the accuracy is also typical Russian D25T-like. It has 3.26 seconds aim time, and it has 0.41 dispersion, which is very, very bad. Also, what's very, very bad is that it only has 1.5k damage per minute. But let's see if the survivability is any good, and ooh, it actually looks like it's kind of worse than a regular T44. But I guess that's also to do because it has a tier 7 tank and not a tier 8 tank. But anyways, it has 75mm of frontal and side hull armor, and it has 45mm at the rear. Turret armor, 90 at the front, 70 at the side, 70 at the rear. So I think this is pretty balanced actually if you compare it to the regular tier 7 Russian medium tank, the T43. The armor layout is about the same, except for the difference that this thing uses a 122mm gun. So let's take a look at the mobility. Again, quite comparable to the T43, so nothing really special there. Concealment is actually rather good for the size of the gun it has, so that's a little plus. And the spotting range is actually 370 meters, which is very decent for a tier 7 Russian medium tank. So overall, what do I think about this thing? I think it's pretty pointless because you can also just use the regular T44 at tier 8 with a 122mm gun. But if you really want to use a T44 like tank with a 122mm gun at tier 7, I think this is going to be your only option. And since it's just exclusive for beta testers, I think your dream is very fastly broken. So that is kind of sad. But anyways, let's just move on to the next secret tank in the Russian line. So next up we have the IS-5, and you might have wondered, wait, we have the IS, the IS-2, the IS-3, the IS-4, we have IS-6, we have IS-7, and we previously had an IS-8. But where the hell is the IS-5? Well, here it is, I guess. This is a tier 8 Russian heavy tank, and actually I know what this tank is meant for. This is actually a real Clan Wars reward, so I guess like 1 year ago, people who played Clan Wars a lot could actually pick this vehicle up in trade of, I guess it's fame points, I guess it's called. I don't know, I'm not really into the clans anymore. So yeah, this is actually a Clan Wars reward tank, but is it any good? Well, let's take a look at it. So it has only 390 alpha damage, which is kind of underwhelming if you compare it to a Defender, but if you compare it to an IS-6, it's actually rather good. That's 221mm of penetration, that average for a tier 8 heavy. 12 seconds reload, also pretty average for the type of gun. It has -5 degrees gun depression, typical Russian. 3 seconds aim time and 0.44 dispersion, so this thing is not particularly accurate. But it does have a semi-okay damage per minute of 1.9k. So let's take a look at the toughness of this thing. So this thing has 1550 hit points, which is slightly above average. It has 120mm of frontal hull armor, 120mm of side hull armor, which makes it very suitable for side scraping, and it has 60mm of rear hull armor. Then for the turret, it has 201 at the front, 129 at the side, and 90 at the rear. But by the looks of it, it looks like quite a bouncy turret, except for those two cupolas, of course. Then mobility, it weighs 49 tons and has a 700 horsepower engine, which results in a horsepower to ton ratio of 14. But with a top speed of 42 kilometers per hour and 14 backwards, with 14 is not really that nice, but still 42 kilometers per hour forwards is actually pretty decent if you compare it to the Defender or the IS-6. So this thing is slightly faster, especially with the horsepower to ton ratio. Then concealment, yeah, typical heavy tank, not really important, and the spotting, just your standard 360 Russian view range. So yeah, what do I think about the IS-5? It's quite a cool tank, but I don't think it is as good as a Defender, but it's definitely better than the IS-6. I guess the IS-5 is kind of like the Defender should be, you know, kind of a little bit more of a balanced version of the Defender. But overall, it looks pretty cool. I just think it's sad and I'm probably never going to be able to get it in my garage. But anyways, let's just move on to the next secret tank in the Russian nation. So next up, we have quite a familiar one. It's the T44 100, and you might think like, what? We already know that T44 100 exists. Why is it even in this list? Well, this is the Y version, and I don't know what the Y stands for. Also, if you take a look at the stats are literally exactly the same as the regular T44 100. So I don't know why Wargaming put this in the game. I think this might be yet another test tank, but I can't really tell you guys since I really don't know what this thing is actually meant for. So next up, we again have a very interesting one, which you already might have heard something about. It's the T103. And this is actually a tier 8 premium Russian tank destroyer. And if you take a look at it from here, it kind of resembles the Su-100Y, especially because it has a massive profile just like the Su-100Y, and it also kind of has the same rear hull as you can see right here. But the main difference with the Su-100Y, except for the tier, is of course that this thing has actually a turret. So how good is it? Well, let's take a look at its stats. So it has a 440 alpha gun with 258mm of penetration, which is very, very good for a tier 8 tank destroyer. It has a 10-second reload time, which is also pretty damn nice considering the Defender has a 13-second reload time. So it has a little bit more DPM than the Defender. So then turret reverse speed, it's 15.64, which is very, very bad. So this thing is going to be very vulnerable to light tanks, of course. But this thing has a very un-Russian -8 degrees gun depression. So hopefully the turret armor is any good, because if that's the case, then this thing is gonna be a true rich line monster. So let's take a look at the accuracy, which is also pretty un-Russian, since it has a 2.2 seconds aim time and it has a 0.35 dispersion rate. So then again, the dispersion isn't really that special, but the aim time is very un-Russian. So let's take a look at the armor, and it looks pretty decent from the blink of the eye. So it has 1250 hit points, which is that average for a tier 8 tank destroyer. It has 100mm of frontal armor at the front, at the sides, and 60mm at the rear. It has 220mm of frontal turret armor, 145 at the sides, and 60 at the rear. So just like I said at the firepower section, I think this thing is gonna be a rich line warrior. But the main thing that I am worried about is that 220mm of turret armor. Is that only the turret? Or does the turret ring count as well? Because if the turret ring doesn't count and the turret ring is actually 100mm thick, that kind of kills it as a rich line warrior. But then again, without the armor model, I can't really tell you guys exactly how to place. So it has good armor, it has a decent gun. Is it any fast? Well, let's take a look at it. It weighs 63 tons, has a 900 horsepower engine, which results in a horsepower to ton ratio of 14, which is not particularly slow, but also not particularly fast. But the top speed is very nice. It has a 40 km/h top speed, so if this thing manages to get some momentum, you can go pretty fast in it. It has a 12 km/h backward speed, and it has a reverse speed of 31 degrees per second, which again is pretty damn decent for a tank destroyer, especially with a rotating turret. And then the concealment, yeah, if you take a look at the silhouette, obviously the concealment isn't that great. But if you take a look at the spotting range, it has 380 meters view range, which is very un-Russian and could very come in handy, especially if you have such a fearsome gun in a turreted tank destroyer. So overall, I believe the T103 is gonna be a future tier 8 Russian tank destroyer, and since we don't have a tier 8 Russian tank destroyer yet, I think this one will fit in quite nicely, especially for the fact that it actually has a rotating turret. So the second option I think Wargaming could do with this is actually put it in a line together with the Object 268 version 5 and make a Soviet turreted tank destroyer line. That indeed also would be pretty damn cool. But obviously, I do not know for sure, so I guess we just have to see what Wargaming's plans are with this thing in the future. So next up, we have a very interesting tank. It's the Object 257. So I think everyone already knows what the Object 257 is. It's of course the tier 9 Russian heavy tank that comes before the IS-7. But this is the P version, and this is actually a tier 10 Russian heavy tank. So I don't know what Wargaming's plans are with these, so let's actually just take a look at the stats, if there are any differences with the tier 9 version. And oh boy, differences there are. It looks like it uses the same gun, but it of course has a much better reload time, it has much better accuracy, it has the same gun depression though, but it also results in having a much better DPM than the tier 9 version. So survivability, again, for the hull, I think it's about the same as the tier 9 vehicle, correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't really remember the 257 stats precisely, but I think the turret is actually better than the tier 9 vehicle, even though it kinda looks the same, with 350mm at the front, 240 at the sides, and 100 at the rear. So let's see if it's as fast as the tier 9 version, and it weighs 55 tons and it has a 1000 horsepower engine. I believe that is more than the tier 9 version, which results in an 18 horsepower to ton ratio, which is pretty quick for a tier 10 heavy tank. It does have the same top speed as the tier 9 version, 50 forwards, 15 backwards, and a 29 degrees per second hold reverse is also pretty nice. So then concealment, it's a heavy tank, so not really important, and spotting range, it actually has 390 meters view range, which is pretty nice, especially considering it's a Russian tank. So yeah, the Object 257P, honestly, I have zero clues why this thing even exists in the game file, since we literally have about the same tank but one tier lower. I don't know, maybe Wargaming was experimenting with the tier 10 version of this, who knows, but I can't really tell you since I really don't know. But again, it actually looks like a pretty cool tank to have at the tier 10 position. So yeah, again, we just have to see what Wargaming's plans are with this thing, if there actually are any. So then next up we have also a very weird one, is the ISU-150. 130. So I can go through this one rather quickly because it's literally just an ISU with a 130mm gun instead of the 152 it usually has in the normal tech tree. So I can skip survivability, mobility, concealment and spotting since they are exactly the same as the regular ISU, but the firepower is of course different because this thing has 490 average alpha damage with 215mm of penetration, which is pretty underwhelming for a tier 8 tank destroyer, but it has a 9.88 second reload, which is very fast, which also results in a crazy DPM of 3,000 damage per minute. And also what I do know about this tank is that the premium ammo is just like the SU-100. And why? So instead of increasing the penetration, it actually increases the alpha damage, but therefore it drops on penetration, which means that the premium ammo of this thing actually does, I think it was 560 damage, which even more bumps up this already crazy average damage per minute. So yeah, that's basically everything I need to tell you about the ISU 130, since the rest is literally the same as the regular ISU. So I actually know where this thing comes from. This thing was actually just a random gift tank that some select people playing World of Tanks actually got, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. And actually, for a fun fact, I know that Slip Phantom actually owns one of these, and I don't really know how he got them. I think it's just something that the NA already decided, but again, I don't really know. The only thing I know that he actually has one, and that this thing has been randomly gifted to some select people of World of Tanks. I don't know anything more about it. Maybe you do. Please let me know in the comment section if you do. But for now, let's just move on to the next Russian secret tank. So next up we have the T-22 medium, and I think most of you veterans already know about this tank, since this tank used to be a reward vehicle for a certain type of game mode of World of Tanks. I kind of forgot what type of game mode it was. I think you guys will probably remember, so if you do, let me know in the comments down below so everyone knows it as well. But this thing is actually a very different tank if you compare it to the normal tier 10 Russian mediums like the Object 140, the 430U and the T62A, and that mainly is because of the hull shape, since this thing actually has a point nose and it has the V-shaped side hull that also the Object 907 has. And actually, a fun fact about this thing used to be terribly OP when it just got released, since the armor was pretty much like an IS-7 hull, and if you put an IS-7 hull on a medium tank with at that time 3000 DPM and with 55 km per hour forwards, which you could reach very easily, I think that is indeed pretty damn overpowered. So this is just the remnants of that tank. As you can see, I'm not going to go through the stats one by one, so you can just check them out right here. So basically this is just a remnant of that past game mode. And also, actually, fun fact, a lot of people actually rigged that game mode. This was quite easily riggable for some reason, but again, I don't really know that much about the game mode and about this tank. All I do know is that this was the reward of that particular game mode, and that a lot of people got this thing through cheating. So furthermore, I don't know if Wargaming has any plans for this thing in the future, maybe to re-implement it in some special game mode. I don't know, I guess we'll just have to wait and see to find that out. So next up we have yet another version of the T44 100, but this is the K version, and just like the Y version, it has exactly the same stats as the regular T44 100, but it has a K behind it. I don't know what it stands for. I guess it's some kind of weird stuff that Wargaming is doing in the background. So yeah, as I told, nothing really special about it, just a T44 with a random letter behind it. So then next up we also have a very interesting one. It's the KV4 1. And as you might have already noticed, this is basically an IS-3, but instead of a point nose, it uses a flat sloped piece of armor. And if you take a look at the stats, the firepower stats and everything except the survivability is pretty much identical to the IS-3, so nothing really special there, except the survivability is slightly different, since it has 140mm of armor, which I believe is going to be around 200-ish effective. And also, I think the lower plate is also not really going to be a weak spot, since the angling, I think, is even steeper than the upper plate. So I think it might result into the same effectiveness. But then again, the turret is exactly the same as the turret on the IS-3, so nothing really special there. So yeah, the KV4 1, I could cover this rather quickly, since it's basically an IS-3, but with a flat sloped hull. And I believe Wargaming has plans for this thing to actually be released as yet another tier 8 Russian premium heavy tank. So I don't know how it's gonna pack out. I guess it's definitely gonna be an interesting one, since most of you are used with the point nose IS-3. I think this one is gonna implement the IS-3 playstyle, but with a slight twist, so you can actually angle with it. So I think that's the reason why this thing is actually gonna be a very good one, and it might even become a better version of the IS-3, especially among the skilled players. So yeah, that was everything I have to tell you about the KV4 1. So now let's move on to the next secret Soviet tank. So next up we have yet another version of the T44 100, but this time is the B version. It has exactly the same stats as the T44 100, but again with a random letter after it. So I'm not going to be wasting too much time about it, just a T44 100, nothing special about it except for the name. And the next vehicle I'm going to be talking about is the Object 244. And if you take a look at it, it kinda looks like an IS with a machine gun mounted on the turret. Actually, I think that's literally the only visual difference. Well, not the only one, this also uses a 100mm gun instead of a 122mm gun, and this is actually a tier 6 heavy tank instead of a tier 7 heavy tank. So let's take a look at its stats. It has 180 AFA damage, which is rather low for a 100mm gun. Does it even have a 100mm gun? Oh! I'm sorry, it has an 85mm gun, so it kinda has the same gun as a T44 85. Therefore it also has 144mm of penetration, 5 seconds reload, which is pretty damn nice for an 85mm. It has 27 degrees per second turret reverse, dead average for a heavy tank, 5 degrees gun depression, typical for Russian tanks, 2.2 seconds aim time and 0.34 dispersion, which is actually worse than a T34 85, and it has 1976 average damage per minute. So let's take a look at the survivability. It has 120mm of frontal hull armor, 100 at the sides and 60 at the rear, and it has 100mm of frontal turret armor, 90 at the sides and 90 at the rear. So armor wise, I think this is gonna be a very strong tank for the tier 6 battlefield, since the armor is pretty much the same as the tier 7 Russian heavy tank, the IS. So that is gonna be a borderline OP thing, but I think we just have to wait until this thing actually gets released to find out for sure. So yeah, mobility, it's pretty much the same as the IS. So it weighs 44 tons, has a 520 horsepower engine, 11.82 specific horsepower to ton ratio, which is actually quite poor for a heavy tank, so I guess that might be a balancing factor Wargaming took in account. But it has a top speed of 42 km per hour forward, so if this thing gets some momentum, it can actually be reasonably fast. But 14 km per hour reverse speed is indeed pretty damn shit if you need to pull back quickly. But a reverse speed of 30 degrees per second is actually pretty damn nice for a heavy tank. So concealment, it's a heavy tank, so not really important, and spotting, it has 340 meters view range, which is absolutely terrible, but then again, it's typical Russian. So overall, I think if the Object 244 gets released into the game as a tier 6 premium tank, it's gonna be a very competitive one, and I think even slightly OP, especially since it has the same armor layout of an IS, but it's simply one entire tier lower. So I think if Wargaming turns this into a tier 6 Soviet premium heavy tank, I think Wargaming has to tweak the armor a little bit in order to make it balance at a tier 6 battlefield, since I don't really see tier 5 and 4 tanks fighting this thing successfully frontally and even from the sides. So yeah, let's hope Wargaming tweaks it before Wargaming actually releases it into the game, if they even want to release it as a premium, of course. But for now, the only thing we can do is hoping, of course, and we can see in the future what Wargaming's plans are with the Object 244. So then next up, as the final, I guess, kind of serious-ish special Russian tank, we have the T44 Lightweight. And I think some of you have already heard something about this tank, but basically if you didn't, this is probably very most likely going to be the first tier 8 Russian premium light tank that is going to be an ideal crew trainer for T44 Lightweight players. But is it any good? Well, let's take a look at it. It uses an 85mm gun with 180 AFA damage, 182mm of penetration, which is rather poor, but then again kinda average for a tier 8 light tank. It has a 4.6 second reload, which is pretty quick, and a typical light tank turret reverse speed. It has -5 degrees of gun depression, which is typical Russian. It has pretty snappy aim time of 1.82 seconds, which is rather decent, but the dispersion is absolutely terrible with 0.38. So I guess Wargaming really doesn't want you to snipe in high tier light tanks. But because of the fast reload, this thing actually has a pretty decent DPM of 2.3k. So survivability wise, it also isn't particularly bad considering it's a light tank. It has 1100 hit points, 90mm of frontal hull armor, 75 at the side, 45 at the rear. So I think that this thing can actually bounce some shots, especially if it's brawling with equal tier light tanks. So turret armor, 120 at the front, 90 at the side, 75 at the rear, which again can be quite a struggle if light tanks actually have to fight this thing. So armor wise, I think the armor is pretty damn good, and I think even a little bit too good for light tank standards at tier 8. So yeah, let's take a look at the mobility. As expected, it's pretty damn fast since obviously it's a light tank. It weighs 31 tons, has an 850 horsepower engine, which results in a horsepower to ton ratio of 27.1, which is pretty quick, of course. It has a 68 km km/h top speed forward, which is very fast even for light tanks, and a 24 km/h backward speed, which also is pretty decent. 52 degrees a second hold reverse speed, which also is typical for light tanks. Then concealment is also pretty decent for light tank standard, and the spotting range is 390 meters. Very un-Russian, but very average for a tier 8 light tank. So overall, I think that the T44 Lightweight is gonna be a very nice crew trainer for people who love to play the T54 Lightweight and the T100 LT. But I think if you take a look at the armor, it might actually be a little bit too good, especially if it's brawling with other light tanks. So in its current state, it's literally just a light tank brawler, and it will completely decimate every other tier 8 light tank on the battlefield. And together with its decent spotting range and concealment and mobility, it might actually also be a very good active scout. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to tell you about the T44 Lightweight. So now I just have 3 more tanks to show you, but these aren't really tanks. I think these are just game mechanics, but I'll just show you anyway, since I think it looks pretty interesting as well. So then the first non-serious is the Spectator, and the Spectator is actually listed as a tier 1 tank from the Soviet Union. As you can see, it's pretty much nothing. Overview, it says Spectator mode. Well, it actually has some stats which I've looked up, and these are exactly the same stats as the MS1. So I think Spectator is literally just an invisible MS1, and I think everyone also knows what this is for. It's obviously to enter the team training as a Spectator mode, but I think it is rather funny that it literally just is an MS1 but invisible. So the final 2 tanks that I want to show you is the T44-85, but instead of the normal T44-85, it's a tier 1 Soviet medium tank, and I think this one is used for maybe some scenarios or something, like for example you see in this garage. Tanks that might be standing there or there, I think they have separate models for that. But if you take a look at the stats, these are exactly the same stats as the T44-85. But hopefully this isn't gonna be a real tank, because this thing at tier 1 would be rather silly indeed. And then as the very last tank in the special branch of the Soviet Union, we have yet another version of the T44-85, but this time it's a tier 2 tank. And it actually uses, I think, one of its stock guns. But for the further rest, except for the gun, it literally has the same stats as the regular T44-85. And I guess this is also some kind of scenario tank that they might maybe use in training rooms or in the tutorial mode. I think that's most likely gonna be the case with this tank. So overall, nothing really special about it except that. But this actually also wraps up the entire video of the special tank showcase of the Soviet Union. And oh boy, at the start of the video, I told you guys it was gonna be much longer than the German one. And I was absolutely right, because the raw recording footage already says 52 minutes. But hopefully this long video was very interesting as well. And hopefully you learned something new about the secret plans Wargaming has potentially with introducing new tanks in the future. So even though this was a very long video, but if you think these kind of videos are interesting, then definitely stay tuned for part 3 of this video, which I'm going to be covering each and every special tank in the American nation. And also, if you haven't seen part 1 already, then make sure to check the link in the description down below and go watch part 1, which is all about each and every special secret tank in the German nation. So yeah, after that, all I wanted to say is that if you enjoyed the video, then make sure to drop a like on it. That would very much help me out on this channel. Also, if you're new to my channel and you like my videos, make sure to smack that subscribe button so you will stay up to date with all my future content. And also, what do you think about the tanks shown in this video? Do you think they are cool? Do you think they suck? Or do you think they're not special at all? Please let me know in the comment section down below. I'm very interested in your opinions as well. But for now, guys, as always, thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and I'll catch you guys later.
Jack it up.